Hello out there. This is the Angry Preacher, the voice of the apocalypse, and the dragon of mothers. When I asked a seminary student the other day what DEI means, they told me it was diversity, equity, and inclusion. I said, no, it's Latin for God. There's no chance in hell that's a coincidence. Yeah, I figure I'm going to have to address the whole conspiracy thing soon. But for me to address this issue, I'm going to start with the idea of representation. My life since the 70s, when I was old enough to recognize what the world was doing around me, representation was an important, if not universally approved of, concept found in legislation, our ability to work, and much. Strangely, most folks in my surroundings didn't have any serious objections to it, and frankly, things like affirmative action were a great success. Most of the complaints were personal. I couldn't get the job I wanted because of it kind of things. So it was astonishing to me how places like California in the last few years fought and succeeded in doing away with it. I could not figure out how such a thing could be desirable by the various groups that benefited the most from it. Some had said they wanted to do away with it so they could use its absence to start a new age of anti-white racism, but now it seems like it was mainly about actually increasing the action to create more opportunities than affirmative action guaranteed for those demographics that benefited from it. I think a real examination of the current state of representation might give us a clue. So let's take a look at a couple current events relating to representation in America today. Before we begin, let me make sure everyone knows what I mean by representation. This is the argument some people have been using for decades as to why it's godly to hire 13% of your workforce as blacks and half as women, if because the general makeup of the population is 13% of blacks and half women. And we were dumb enough to go along with it at first. I came across an interesting poll or study the other day that sums this up clearly. Did you know that according to a recent study by Bloomberg, that only 6% of the new hiring since COVID have been Caucasians, in a country that currently boasts 57% Caucasian residents? So apparently we're just throwing representation out the window. That's not representation or misrepresentation. The corporations will always pay as little as possible for employees. That's just good for business. Here's another indication that I found recently and is a little alarming. I recently decided to try out this AI generation of art thing from text prompts that seem to be so popular lately. As a software engineer for a few decades, I know these things are really very advanced predictive algorithms using what we used to call fuzzy logic. They're not really what we think of as AI when we hear it in the movies. The marketing departments of corporations are just using the AI term to sell things to us that, believe me, they love this AI term. But that's another story. Anyway, I love Adobe. I've been using Photoshop since I had a photography business back in the early 90s, and it's pretty damn great and always has been. So I thought I'd try their AI program, which they call Firefly. And here's the result. So according to the Firefly AI, 75% of Americans are women, and 50% are black. I then tried to add things like not female, not women, not girls, and that changed nothing. I included things like Caucasian, white, not black, and again, it literally changed nothing. Normally, I don't care about this garbage and this political stuff, but it was just really in your face. By any definition of racism, save one, this fits. I tried others, such as Kittle, and it didn't produce such lopsided results. That one definition that doesn't fit happens to be the one that's being taught around today, that only whites can be racist because you have to have power to be racist. I'd like to point out two things. First, if these and many more examples are so prevalent, then it could be argued who exactly has that power today. Are the people who seize power through accusation of racism going to be equally as fair-minded and committed to fairness after they gain the power? They haven't been so far. Okay, so I've given the opposing side plenty of ammo against me. Let me explain what this has to do with Christianity. First, let me just say that this is likely the only time I'll address this racism thing in modern America. It's really not my focus. I'm using it to make a point. Any and all use of the Bible to justify that kind of crap usually centers around some curse, usually Noah's son Ham, or less frequently the mark of Cain, and it's dumb for a couple of reasons. The most important being that as Christians, we are new creations, born again, and those curses no longer apply. As a young man in the 80s and most of the 90s, there was far less of this kind of racism crap that there is. There were obviously several high-profile cases like Rodney King and others, but it seems we have moved backward as a country in this regard, and it's completely orchestrated for political reasons that can be summed up with a quote from Lenin himself, and that is, "We must hate. Hate is the basis of communism. Children must be taught to hate their parents if they are not communist. Hate is simply another tool to be used without any of the moral repugnance attached to it that is so gut-wrenching and toxic to our Western minds. Just take a look at any news channel on any media any day of the week if you doubt it." And there's another from a famous communist written decades later. This former communist commissar of education, Anatoly Lunacharsky, wrote, "We hate Christians and Christianity. Even the best of them must be considered our worst enemies. Christian love is an obstacle to the development of the revolution. Down with the love of one's neighbor. What we want is hate. Only then will we conquer the universe." You get that? He's in charge of education. He's an educator. So as often as they are accused of being godless, they do have a higher power just like we do. Ours is based on love, and theirs is on hate. Let's look at what Paul says in Romans 1:21 through 25. "Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own heart, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." Now, a quick search on Google for other theologians' interpretations of these verses will unfortunately only turn up these verses in the whole book of Romans interpreted in legalistic lawyers' version, meaning that they are paying more attention to the letter of the law than the intention. Is it any wonder our youth are leaving in droves? Viewing the Bible in this manner really gives no redeeming value to the Bible or being. We really have to drop this viewing of the New Testament through a legalistic. First of all, let me do my usual Greek concordance context thing that I so love to do. "Because of that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful." First of all, when they say knew God, the word being used is ginosko, which is a verb that means to come to know or to realize, but the implication is that one has a relationship with God, that you've taken the time to come to know God, a realization. It's like realizing something. It is support for the concept of a personal relationship that reaffirms our trust, just like you would trust a friend after a friend you've been working with for a while and he comes through consistent. We can have that kind of relationship with Jesus. That actually describes very well my coming to believe in him and coming to trust. I'm convinced by the evidence. So then, when they came to know and trust God by his faithfulness, okay, stay with me, this is going to be worth it. The next word is glorified, which in Greek is doxazo, another verb or action word, and it means to attribute weight and significance to the object, in this case, God. But as a twist, it says that they glorified him not as God. This takes us back to my paper on Job's friends, who were told they did not ascribe the weight and significance of God correctly. They bought the lie that God punished Job for Job's sin. As I've demonstrated constantly, fear and punishment are not the weight and significance of God. It's a lie of fear the enemy uses, and one we are all going to have to struggle with this coming year. So now we've got, when they came to know and trust God by his faithfulness, they ascribed his weight and significance not as God actually is, but as he was not. That could mean as the great punisher that they could use to win arguments or manipulate into giving them a better life by ritual or the right prayer or whatever, by any of 100 of common modern versions of God around today. That he is an abusive father that wants to punish you anytime you're having fun, when the truth is he is a father that just wants you to stop hurting yourself. This message is critical to reaching the younger generations who are turning their back on him. The rest of the verse, the little Greek, goes something like this. After they ascribed to God characteristics that weren't God's nature, they became futile, a word that means, I can't even pronounce it, amatithososin or something like that, became vain and futile or irrelevant in their thinking, a word dialogimos, which is a speculation or imagination, of them, and was darkened, a word skotizo, which means their understanding or their mind were darkened or lost light. The foolishness, which is a word as sunetos, lacking synthesis, okay? It describes a person failing to structure information in a meaningful way, therefore unable to reach necessary conclusions, all right? This person is illogical because he's unwilling to use good reason of their heart. So if we put all that together, we come up with, when they came to know and trust God by his faithfulness, they ascribed his weight and significance not as God actually is, but as he was not. Their knowledge of him became vain and irrelevant, and that affected their speculations and imaginations. Their heart became dark, and they refused to acknowledge truth and unable to even understand truth. Doesn't that sound like what Yuri Bezhmov warned us about? But the neither were thankful part, and the reason I left it for last, is because it brings it all together to the gospel itself. The word used for thankful is Eucharistio. Its root is the word for grace. literally thankful for God's grace, the same grace that Paul calls the message of the gospel in Galatians, unmerited favor. This is the character of God they ignored in their foolishness. Remember that in Galatians, Paul says multiple times, the message of the grace is gospel and peace, and anyone that sends you a different message, let them be damned. Grace is hugely important, lest we rely on our good works and our good deeds and following the rules, lest we cannot understand the true meaning of faith. When they came to know and trust God by his faithfulness, they ascribed to him weight and significance, not as God actually is, but as he was not. They did not believe in God's unmerited favor. Their knowledge of him became vain and irrelevant, and that affected their speculations and imaginations. Their heart became dark, and they refused to acknowledge the truth and were unable to understand the truth. Their vanity and illogic led them to attempt to know God through their works, to earn their salvation not through grace, and that leads to Paul's warning about illogically and vainly judging and putting down others to elevate themselves. So in the next verse, they said, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. That's fairly self-explanatory. Those types of people always seek to elevate themselves rather than accept the incredible gift of grace. What might that look like? Virtue signaling, intersectionality, a church built on good works that is overly concerned with conformity, a hierarchy of victimhood or congratulating themselves that at least they aren't as bad as that other person, feeling justified to lie, cheat, steal, or even kill. Remember, their God is hate, and these are the tools that are the antithesis of love. The last bit, became foolish, can be translated literally as became tasteless or made useless. Lukewarm, if you like. It's a different Greek word than the foolish one we just saw 2 verses before. This is what legalism looks like. Critical race theory and intersectionality were invented by lawyers, funnily enough, in an attempt to justify the actions of their criminal clients. So let's go on to the next one. They changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So often theologians, professional or lay, will use this verse to say something about how pagans and Old Testament Israelis who had lost their way think about the golden calf, right? Well, they resort to idolatry, and it's hard to argue. But within the context of what we just looked at, I might suggest something different, something that might fit better with the idea that the people, particularly the Romans this letter is written to, who had a Caesar as their god king. I'm going to look at 4 words. Uncorruptible, which is aphthartos, an adjective that modifies the word of God that follows to specifically give it the attribute of undecaying, imperishable, indestructible, or incorruptible. This is being used as a comparison to the word corruptible, which is phthartos, another adjective that modifies the noun of man for comparison, and this root literally means waste away, moving down from a higher level to a lower level. This indicates that the aforementioned fools, who believe that God wants us to struggle and fight to become perfect and merit their own righteousness through their self, end up making the incorruptible and eternal God into a lower form comparable to man. Sound familiar? The remaining section of the verses seem to reinforce this anthropomorphization. God is like us, and this is what we want, so we justify our actions as godly since we are in essence the same as God. What could be a better description of the communist philosophy or indeed the New Age beliefs? Talking about the animals in this verse does seem to talk about the pagan and Israeli tendency to idolize animals such as the golden calf. I would like to point out that there is no example throughout history of a culture that didn't have something fill the role of God. I've seen modern studies using PET scans to indicate we are hardwired as a species to do this. There's a specific part of the brain that is only in use when we engage in spiritual practices. I say spiritual practices because the study used things like prayer and meditation to activate that part of the brain. It's kind of difficult to fit God into a study like this. It takes an hour to set up a PET scan, and then God has to obey our timeline to actually test with us. This is actually the point of this entire discussion. These people who are super materialistic elevate their virtue signaling to the point the acronym is Latin for God. Without getting to the point beyond any supporting evidence, I'll just say the folks pushing this are not godless, they just have a different God. And the goal is to get all of us completely materialistic and reject the idea of any spiritual world beyond Ghost Hunter. This is even brought home more strongly by the next verse, verse 24. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Okay, so the first thing we need to address here is a rehash of the word heart in the Bible. There are 2 points you need to remember when talking about the use of the word heart. First, it's always used to describe the more ephemeral description of the heart, things like will or strength of character. And most importantly, today we talk about the heart in terms of love. That's like Hallmark, heart emoji, giving my heart to you, etc. This idea did not exist in the times the Bible was written. It almost always refers to a person's strength of will. That's why when one surveys the use of heart in the Bible, it can seem contradictory. That's when we picture now, not what they picture then. We say, that hurt my heart to see you homeless, something my ex told me. While when Jesus saw the masses suffering, he felt it in his splanchna, which means guts. The actual translation of splanchna, the inward parts, especially the nobler organs like lungs, liver, kidneys, etc. So in the Bible, the word heart is not the Hallmark version, things like affection and compassion and their attendant emotion. They're found in the gut. In Mark 7:21-23, when it is said, "For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts," it means your self-will, your ego, the strength. They're producing these things that are related to pride and ego. This is a case of us using today's common knowledge and applying it backwards when it really doesn't apply. So let's look at the few more of the words from this verse in context. The first word is dio, which means consequently, because, therefore, on account of. The next one is paradidomi. It's a verb meaning to hand over or to give over or to betray to. Uncleanness or akatharsis, noun meaning physically or morally uncleanness, infected. Lusts is epithemia, a longing, especially for what is forbidden. And then it says deceiving desires for what is forbidden. So when it comes to sex and the attribution we give it to the word lust, that was created later. It has always meant either deceiving desires or desire for pleasing God, depending on the context. And then atamazo, which is dishonor, and it means disgrace or to treat disgracefully or to dishonor or to insult. And the reason I'm going through all this is the Greek is very specific, much more than English. Each word uses conjugations to describe its relationship to all the other words in the sentence. So let's take a quick look, including these definitions, all right? If we put all these definitions in there, that verse comes out like this. As a result of their mischaracterizing God, the deceiving desires of their ego infected and corrupted their logic or morals, and they sought to destroy the larger body of which they were a part. Now, that's an equally valid translation from what I can tell. You can grab a concordance, an interlinear Bible. I'm using King James and the Septuagint, and look it up for yourself. This alternate still sounds within the gospel. It still fits with what we know of Paul's other writings and removes the legalistic courtroom view of the Bible. It actually makes it look more like an illness than fire and brimstone. And that makes sense to me. You know, all the courses in school I took on criminology, the first thing they did was teach us that the most effective way to deal with crime is within the context of a disease. So now if we're going to put all that together, it comes out as when they came to know and trust God by his faithfulness, they ascribed his weight and significance not as God actually is, but as he was not. They did not believe in God's unmerited favor. Their knowledge of him became vain and irrelevant, and that affected their speculations and imaginations. Their heart became dark, and they refused to acknowledge the truth or even unable to understand the truth. Their works became vain and them wise, but was cringe. The previous fools that believe that God wants us to struggle and fight to become perfect and merit our own righteousness through ego end up making the incorruptible and eternal God into nothing more than what man can accomplish. As a result of their mischaracterizing God, the deceiving desires of their ego infected and corrupted their logic or morals, and they sought to destroy the larger body they were a part. And then in the last verse, and so they created a false god and gave that created thing the weight and significance to the true God, and their good works to that false version of God. Now, a lot of theologians, professional or lay, may not like this take on it, but it's really not that different. It's just focused more on the glory of God's grace and legalistic judgment. It is next to impossible for us to let go of the image of God punishing us. As things get worse in the material world, we turn to blame and guilt, to the point that even if viewing God in this way is unimaginably good news, like Job's friends, we believe it can't be right. The people we judge for whatever reason can't be loved or blessed the same way we are. Grace is unmerited, kind of. But the part that really strikes me is how well this fits in with what we are seeing around us today. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who looks at some of the rioting and screaming people in this country, and I'm just baffled. Disgusted, yes, but also baffled. Their image of God is DEI, day. It's the communist version of hate that is justified because the rest of us aren't performing the same kind of good works they are. It fits so cleanly with these concepts found in Romans 1:21 through 25 that I honestly think there's a connection. And so does Dr. Schwartz, who wrote the first seminal work on communism, You Can Trust the Communists to Be Exactly Who They Are. Even if you don't believe in the mystical and supernatural parts of the Bible, it's kind of hard to deny lives are better when we aren't whipping our own flesh for another shot of joy, or when we aren't screaming and wishing death on our neighbors so that we don't feel irrelevant, ignored, and empty. Is it really that hard to believe that Lenin can figure this out about people, but the Bible can't? All those people in the Bible were us. Same feelings, same fear, same insecurity, same bad judgment. When Paul or others talk about these things, he's talking about the same thing. They just didn't have PET scans or the philosophy of Freud back then.